It looks like you can't get enough of history class, can you? You told us you liked our other videos about the retro movement and the cool 1960s, so we had to make more. What do you know? We did too. We looked around and found even more interesting pictures that'll help you understand that time and the ways it affected culture. Take a walk through history while wearing your coolest hippie glasses. Back then, color matching didn't exist, and there were no rules or limits. Adoring Liza Manelli. Liza Manelli married Australian singer Peter Allen in 1967. She's an actress and a singer. Liza became famous on her own, even though she was Judy Garland's daughter. She did well in Cabaret and the Sterile Cuckoo. She met Allen while they were both acting at a New York bar. They fell deeply in love and got married at a small wedding in New York City. Today, Liza is a sign of the 60s, and not just because of the movies and shows she was in. Those were not just glam and glory times. They had sad stories about people who used drugs, had broken homes, and made terrible choices in life. Elvis the Judoka. We always think of the King when we hear the type of music called rock and roll. He was an important figure in the 60s because he set trends in dress and music and pretty much ran the world at the time. Besides all the time he spent on stage, Elvis loved to practice karate in his spare time. In the 1960s, his master, Hank Slamansky, helped him get a black belt. He had two sides. One was soft and beautiful, like when he played music, and the other was rough, like when he spent days in the dojo. Anyone can be a king or queen, and this side of the king just shows that. Elvis had sides that not everyone knew about. Nancy Quan. Nancy Quan made the first Chinese-American movie, The World of Susie Wong, which came out in the 1960s. At a time when Asian-American movies weren't very common, her part was very important. Since then, Asian women have become big stars and are in charge of their fields all over the world. Other Asian women saw Hollywood as a job path because of Quan. She was the one who opened the way for them. During the flower power era, rules were broken. Things that were once seen as taboo became acceptable, and Asian women started to show up on TV and in movies. Michael Caine. In this old picture from 1969, Sir Michael Caine seems to be showing off his hands. He's had a very interesting career lasting over 70 years, so it makes sense that many people see him as a British film hero. Caine was in many movies and was known for his Cockney accent. He played Ebenezer Scrooge in The Muppet Christmas Carol and Alfred Pennyworth in the Dark Knight trilogy. Sir Michael Caine was born during a time of great cultural change. It was a decade when many great British artists were born and when walls between classes were broken down. Those were good times, and Caine made the most of every chance that came his way. Bowie of the 1960s. This picture shows David Robert Jones, better known as David Bowie, wearing John Stevens' clothes with Jan D'Souza. The picture was taken in 1965 by Fiona Adams for a British pop music magazine. People thought that Bowie was one of the most important artists of the 20th century because of how strange he was on stage and how different his music was. Bowie became famous all over the world and left a lasting impression in the 1970s, but it was during Flower Power that he found himself and took advantage of the changes happening in the world, making such an amazing and important body of music. Riding the 1960s. It wasn't all about colors, music, lines, and flares during the Flower Power era. They were also about being brave and riding bikes. Evel Knievel was the most daring person in the world before DIY pranksters started filming their acts for TV. Evel Knievel tried to jump over the pools at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. This picture shows him doing so. At the time, this was crazy and had never been done before. Evel Knievel didn't make the jump, which was about 141 feet high. He went into a coma for 28 days after the accident, but his failed act and subsequent coma brought him more fame, and he became more well-known than ever. Legendary guitar. We can learn a lot about the late Jimi Hendrix from this picture. It also shows plenty about the 1960s. It's strong because it was taken before he died too soon in 1970. Everyone knows that he was a great player and that he inspired a lot of people during his rule. People will always remember the story left behind. Because he sang and played his music, he's one of the best musicians ever. A lot of people recognized his work in music, so much that they put him in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Northern Lights. The stunning Swedish actress Maud Selvig Christina Adams is shown in the picture here. As the eponymous character in Octopussy in 1983, she played the first Bond girl in The Man with a Golden Gun in 1974, and as the second, she played two different Bond girls. Adams was seen as the most beautiful and famous person in the world. Adams remembers playing small parts in the James Bond movies more than 30 years ago. She still thinks about roles like Octopussy, the famous seductress. During the 1960s, she was a big star and added something new to the big screen. DIY fallout shelters. During the Cold War, people became more worried about nuclear war, which made them pay more attention to their safety. There was so much fear that the media even told people to build their nuclear bunkers at home. The basement seemed like the most natural place to build the shelter. They weren't meant to be shelters, though. They were meant to be places where a family could live happily for a long time. Luckily, they were never needed for nuclear war. Instead, they were often used as extra stores or even as shelters during storms. Burlesque dancers. Virginia Bell is one of the most famous and loved burlesque dancers of all time. People still remember her with love, even though she stopped performing in shows almost 50 years ago. Virginia Bell was born on August 14, 1934, in Montrose, California. Her full name is Virginia Miriam Beck. She was born to John Charles Beck and Frida Jugend. Her high school diploma was given to her in Los Angeles in 1949, and her community college diploma came around 1951. She was married for a short time to Charles Merle Bell and then to Eli Jackson, who worked as a candy seller at a burlesque theater. Jackson later married her in 1961, movie Belle, Bear, and Beautiful. She had 3 children with him: Pierre Joseph Jackson, born in 1961, Tyrone Eli Jackson, born in 1962, and Todd George Jackson, born in 1964. The banana bike. You could not get enough of the banana bike in the 1960s. It was also called the wheelie bike and the spider bike. The handlebars were too big and looked a little bit like motorbike handles. Their popularity may have come from how cool they seemed without trying too hard. It was also a great way to get kids to leave the house, play outside, and hang out with their friends. Dream of Genie. It was a comedy called I Dream of Genie. Other popular TV shows at the time were Gilligan's Island, The Dick Van Dyke Show, Star Trek, and Bonanza. A 2,000-year-old genie woman and her astronaut husband were trying to get used to regular life in the suburbs in this strange story. Some people didn't like what actress Barbara Eden wore that day, but the show became a hit at the time. The Era of Bridget Bardot. Bridget Bardot was one of the most famous women in the 1960s. Bardot was born in France, which gave her that it factor that made her seem unique. Movies like The Night Heaven Fell, Love Is My Profession, and Contempt made her famous. She was usually cast as the lead in her movies, but she did make it into a few different types of movies. Flying in luxury. In the 1960s, taking Pan Am was like traveling in style, since most economy planes today don't have much headroom. The rooms were much farther apart and had lots of space for legs and seats. But there were other risks back then, even ones that could have hurt the flight that would still make long, crowded trips today much more appealing. If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon